So, good morning, everyone. Today I'll just focus on the library acoustics. And there's a lot of nice literature, both in the architectural history and theory, but also on the very technical acoustics research that's now emerging only in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, where people on the technical side are interested in historical buildings, things like cathedrals or churches or other theaters, for example. But then also on the architectural history and theory side, there's a lot of nice literature that's exploring sound. I'll try to give a general overview today and then go into some of the more specific technical tests that were done at the library in the recent years. So when we talk about architectural acoustics, there's maybe two key areas that we have to consider. And one is room acoustics and the other is building acoustics. And so room acoustics, you might be interested in, say, the reverberation inside the rotunda or inside the reading rooms, the amount of echo and how long that takes to decay, or maybe the background noise inside these rooms. And building acoustics would be much more something that you're concerned with how sound is insulated through the building, so from between rooms. For example, in the offices above the reading rooms, down below, or from rooms beside one another. Now, architectural acoustics is actually not such an old field. It's really around 120 years old, and the main pioneer is Wallace Sabine, or Sabine. And he was a physics professor at Harvard, and they asked him, they built this new lecture hall, and the acoustics were so terrible that basically it was almost unusable. He conducted all sorts of measurements in the lecture hall, but also in other sorts of buildings, in the Boston Public Library, in laboratory spaces, and in other settings. And based on all of these measurements, he came up with this very simple equation, which is now known as the Sabin equation. And if we just go through it briefly, we have, so the reverberation time, or the amount that an echo takes to decay. We have a constant, which is related to the speed of sound in air, the volume of a room, V, the surface area of the room, and this alpha, which is an absorption coefficient that goes between 0 and 1. So 0 is a perfectly reflective material, 1 is a perfectly absorptive material. And so just straightforward, if we have a larger volume, then we're going to have a larger reverberation time, longer echoes. If we have more surface area that are more absorptive, this term becomes bigger and then the time goes down. So it's straightforward. And what's interesting about this equation, it really opened up really the whole field of architectural acoustics in a modern way, where this could be used to diagnose problems in previous buildings or previous lecture halls like the one at Harvard, but also people in the construction industry could start to develop new materials and test their performance. And there's then quickly a number of laboratory studies where databases could be built up with things like flooring, like linoleum materials, or stone or glass. And the field really opened up as this, and this was this kind of watershed moment. This happened in 1898. But at the same time, this equation, what's missing? And it's really architectural form. There's no description of geometry. This point was made in a recent book by Joseph Clark. And it was really nice that this simple equation really challenged a centuries-long tradition of architects trying to visualize sound or adjusting their plans of their theaters to maybe concentrate sound in one area for, say, a patron, or later on in other centuries to have this more democratic view where acoustics performance would be equal in all parts of the seats. And what's interesting, this classical tradition also continued in the modern movement. There's many examples with, say, Aalto, which we saw yesterday, the Vitpuri lecture hall with this undulating ceiling, but also Aalto's church in Vokseniska, where they made this physical model with light to try to show how sound would radiate from the pulpit. And even though the modern movement in some ways was trying to break away from classicism, then there's still this method of trying to trace or visualize sound continued through. And there's also examples by Le Corbusier, for example, with the League of Nations proposal, and many others. And by the way, this church in eastern Finland, in Imatra, it's currently undergoing renovation. We probably don't have to guess who is taking care of that. So, I mentioned it was 1898 that Sabin did all these measurements, right? There's no electricity, there's no digital sensors. So how did he do this? His source was a simple portable pipe organ, and he used just a simple stopwatch. And if you think he's measuring reverberation times of maybe 2-3 seconds or so, human reaction time is maybe 1/10 of a second. So he's already working with an accuracy of maybe 5%, which is probably really good. This was an image from his laboratory in the 1920s, and it's the same principle, but then they're trying to really eliminate the effect of the human body, and it makes for this interesting image. 100 years later, so we have this sort of the human body as the instrument. My old acoustics professor used to say that the human ear and the human brain together are really the most sophisticated instrument for acoustics that you'll ever use. And he's certainly right, it's illustrated in this example. But then my photo from 100 years later in the library, we can see now the instrument today it's almost become a bit like the human body, and that there's this interesting play that things are going back and forth. And so far I've talked about room acoustics and how echoes or reverberation time work. Building acoustics came much later, but it was still something that was this key second part of the development. And it came later because they needed the instrumentation. It's something you can't measure with just a stopwatch. And here in Sweden, the main leading person who was conducting these acoustic experiments was Henrik Kruger. He was a professor at KTH, and he's really known as this kind of structural engineer who's a pioneer in reinforced concrete. He also served on the library committee, and his engineering firm was also responsible for many of the engineering plans, the structural plans of the library. So in 1924, he published this kind of state-of-the-art review of building acoustics in Sweden, and it outlined more or less just how they were developing this instrumentation, this electrical analog methods to measure basically loudness or perceived loudness and sound pressure. And then by 1928, there's another publication where they're starting now to look at various different construction, wall buildups and sections. And it's this time that corresponds well with the original 1924, 25 to 28 time of the library. And so as Marcelo highlighted already, the sections in the 1920s part, we think that it looks like this. So this reinforced concrete, steel beams, and then this fill of lime gravel and coke ash, and then with the typical cement subfloor above. But in the 1932 area, the western wing, as Marcelo highlighted, we have the same structural system, but then this layer of compressed straw or solomite, this aerated concrete, which is now also really a worldwide product still in use today. It was really developed here at KTH in Stockholm, and interestingly, it was used in the library as a kind of in situ product, whereas today it's usually this kind of prefabricated, very accurate product. But the in situ version was much more difficult to work with. It was this chemical reaction that as the concrete cures, it's really creating this porosity. And so we have these two different floor sections in the library, two different types of materials, and then it really begs the question or creates the research question that how do these perform acoustically in terms of their building acoustics? And the solomite it was often published as this kind of thermal insulation material, but here being used in an internal floor, it's most certainly being used as an acoustic layer, as acoustic insulation layer. So I'll go back to the room acoustics. So we're looking at echo and reverberation in the rotunda. I have a video here with some sound so that you can hear it. This is just a standard contemporary test. Hold on. And instead of like Sabine, who used a pipe organ, now we can use speakers, which produces white noise. So it's this randomized noise that has equal power across all frequencies, and we can measure all frequencies simultaneously. Here. So I'll hold up the microphone to try to give you an impression of this. So that would be a typical reverberation test that was done. And we can hear roughly the reverberation time in the rotunda. Oh, sorry. Here are the test results. And for the typical frequencies for human speech, the reverberation time is very high in the rotunda, around 5.5 seconds, almost 6 seconds. This is very high for a work environment. And this is almost cathedral-like. And the people trying to work, the librarians at the center of the rotunda. This is where the photo from 1928 when the library opened. This would have been extremely difficult. Not just this general reverberation time, but because the space is circular, there's also this concentrated effect. The sound is focused more in the center. But then there's also this fluttering echo where instead of just a simple decay, especially in the center, if you were there yesterday, you can maybe hear it sort of comes back also within this 5 seconds, or it flutters. This is the main reason today why we don't have this landing desk in the center of the space also. The reading rooms, in terms of their reverberation time, are much more reasonable, around 2 seconds for the 1920s, and a little bit lower, around 1.5 seconds or so for the 1932 part. And my understanding of this result is that the 1930s part had this additional layer of books on the gallery level, and so it has a little bit more absorption that lowers that reverberation a little bit more. Whereas the smaller and larger reading rooms in the 20s time, if you think of them proportionally, they're the same in terms of their surface areas and their volumes and the amount of books and windows. Things are still in proportion, whether it's a small reading room or a large one. So now, if we come to the original question about the building acoustics and the differences between these two floor slabs. There are two types of building acoustic tests. One is an airborne sound test. So I take that speaker that we saw in the rotunda, and if I put it in the offices above the reading rooms, we can measure the loudness in those offices and then take another measurement inside the reading rooms, and we get this difference to us. So we can assess this what's called this airborne sound insulation. So if people were talking in the offices or they had loud music or something, how would that sound transmit to the reading rooms? And in both cases, the 1928 and 32 parts of the library perform very similar. And if we compare them to contemporary construction and standards, this is also, they achieve a kind of normal level of performance of adequate, of normal construction, which is quite adequate. If we compare the impact sound, which again, I'll just show you a quick movie. We use this machine called, it's a tapping machine, and it's a standardized test, and it's meant to simulate walking on the floor. And this it's to assess this impact insulation. So if someone drops something off their desk and it hits the floor, or someone's walking down the hallway at the offices with hard shoes, for example, or hard-heeled shoes, this type of machine is a standard way, an approximation of that. So these are just simple, very precisely weighed masses that are dropped from a defined height, and it's repeated. And this process then, if we go to the reading rooms, it sounds like this, the test. Right, so it's much more muffled. And if we compare now the 1920s and 30s part, there's actually a very significant difference. And the 1930s part, despite having this special acoustic insulation layer, performed far more poorly compared to the 1920s part. And there's this key issue of how sound, and especially in these insulation tests, sound can flank around and take different paths, and the sound will always take the path of least resistance. And I moved the tapping machine. So if we have, say, one's the steel beam to the floor, I started 1 meter away from the steel beam and then moved the tapping machine in increments for various tests until I was directly above steel beam, and then moved continually away. And we can see that the sound pressure level in the reading room below increased. And I think this was really the key, the shortcut of the flanking, that the flanking issue with the 1932 part. And if we consider the section also, the solomite, which is supposed to act as a kind of acoustic insulation layer, it's really in the wrong place, right? So the subfloor is in good contact with the steel beam, which is also embedded in the lower reinforced concrete floor. There's no suspended ceiling. And if we were to redo this today, maybe in contemporary construction, you just have your reinforced slab, then your insulation layer, and then your subfloor above. It would have been much better to have the aerated concrete or the gas béton below, and then to run the solomite above, including above the flange, and then to build the subfloor above. So there's this proper separation between the subfloor and the actual structure. So if anyone's interested in further reading, I mentioned there are these two fields that are really developing now. Historical acoustics on the one side, looking at older theaters and things, but from a more technical perspective, really with acousticians. But this one book, which I mentioned the author already, Joseph Clark's Echoes Chambers, it's a really fascinating read from an architectural history side. These two fields aren't really interacting so much. And I think there's a lot of potential in the future for these types of collaborations, not just to perform the simple test, but maybe to understand a little bit the broader architectural context also of these buildings. And also with libraries in general, I think they're not usually thought of as a kind of acoustic building type, or they're not strongly associated maybe with acoustics compared to, say, a concert hall or other types of buildings, say a church or so. But because they have this dual aspect of the building acoustics and the room acoustics, I think it's really relevant. And we all know how libraries now are becoming more social spaces and have to adjust their acoustics. This is really an interesting issue that we can look at in the future. And I think there's also far more potential to do more types of these tests in other types of libraries. But the key part is knowing the construction and knowing what you're dealing with, rather than having to do the test in a kind of blind way without knowing the underlying fabric. Lastly, some acknowledgements. And with that, Thank you very much, and I'll take questions. Thanks.